June 1st, 1991, Philadelphia. A borrowed limousine pulls up to the emergency room at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. It is just before dawn. The doors open. A man is pulled out and left right there on the concrete. The car speeds off into the dark. The man on the ground is rail thin, barely breathing, dressed like a drifter who has been wandering the streets for days. The doctors rush him inside. They check his pulse. They check his pockets. No identification, no wallet. But here's the detail that makes this whole thing so chilling. People who knew him said he was carrying $40,000 in cash that night, tucked inside a money belt. Gone. Every single dollar vanished. He is pronounced dead from a cocaine overdose shortly after. Just another tragic statistic in West Philly. Until somebody finally realizes who they are looking at. The man lying on that cold hospital table is not a drifter. He is the lead singer of the Temptations. He is the voice of My Girl. He is the man who brought millions of dollars to Motown Records and defined the sound of an entire generation. David Ruffin. So how does this happen? How does a man who had the entire world in the palm of his hand end up dumped on a sidewalk like a bag of garbage? How does royalty die broken alone? It is time you knew the real story. Let us get right into it. Wynant, Mississippi, 1941. Even the name of the town sounds like a cruel joke. It was the kind of place where dirt roads led to more dirt roads, and opportunity was something you only heard about on the radio. It was deep in the American South, segregated, poor, hard. And right from the very beginning, life decided to test this boy. His birth name was Davis Eli Ruffin. But before he could even form his first memory, before he could even say a single word, his mother died. He was 10 months old. 10 months. Think about that for a second. The one person in the world who is supposed to love you unconditionally is taken away before you even know her face. So he was left with his father. His father was Eli Ruffin, a strict Baptist minister. But do not let the title fool you. This was not a warm man of cloth who gathered his children around for bedtime stories. This was a hard man, a heavy-handed man. He believed in the fear of God, and he made sure his children felt that fear every single day. The beatings were brutal. The emotional abuse was constant. The house was not a home. It was a place of punishment. David did not have a childhood. He had a survival camp. Every day was about avoiding the wrath of a man who stood over him like a giant shadow. But there was one thing Eli Ruffin did give his son: the church, the music. The family traveled around the South singing gospel. They called themselves the spiritual Aries. Young David was put in front of the congregation to sing. He was tiny, but that voice was already huge. It was raw. It was raspy. It was filled with a kind of pain that a boy his age should not even know yet. People in the pews would cry when he sang. They thought it was the Holy Spirit. They did not know the tears came from the bruises under his Sunday suit. The church stage became the only place where he felt any power, where he felt seen, where the abuse stopped for just a few minutes. But a stage in a country church is still in Mississippi, and David knew if he stayed in that house, he was going to die there. So he ran. As a teenager, he packed up whatever he had and left the South behind. He followed the path that so many black families took during the Great Migration. He headed north, to the Motor City, Detroit, Michigan. He was running toward a dream of making it big. But here's the tragic truth about trauma. You can cross state lines. You can change your zip code. You can even change your name. But the ghosts from your childhood ride in the passenger seat the whole way. He arrived in Detroit with a golden voice and a broken soul. Detroit in the early 1960s was a factory town making more than just cars. Berry Gordy was building an absolute empire at Motown Records. He was taking raw talent from the streets and turning them into polished royalty. David Ruffin wanted in. He hung around the Hitsville studio. He networked. He hustled. And in 1964, his moment finally arrived. He was asked to join a group called the Temptations. Now listen to me. The Temptations were already a good group before David Ruffin. They had harmony, they had the moves, but they were missing that one spark to set the entire world on fire. David was that spark. The second he stepped into the lineup, everything changed. He brought an undeniable swagger, the thick black-rimmed glasses, the sharp-tailored suits, the way he walked onto the stage like he owned every single inch of the floorboards. He was electrifying. Then came the song that altered the course of music history. Smokey Robinson had written a tune. He was watching David perform and realized that this new guy had a voice that could carry a masterpiece. Smokey gave him the lead vocal on My Girl. Picture the recording studio. That iconic bass line starts walking. The guitar drops in. And then David Ruffin opens his mouth. His voice was not some perfectly clean pop vocal. It was rough. It was gritty. It had the deep, agonizing pain of a Mississippi childhood mixed right up with the slick ambition of a Detroit star. When he sang, you heard a man who was desperately begging for love and proudly celebrating it at the exact same time. It was a vocal performance so powerful that it went straight to #1. It crossed over to every demographic. White audiences, black audiences, everyone lost their minds over this track. Overnight, the Temptations became global superstars. They were the biggest vocal group on the planet. They were on massive television programs. They were selling out legendary theaters from coast to coast. And David Ruffin was the undisputed center of the universe. When he took the lead, the crowds went absolutely hysterical. He would grab the microphone stand and drop to his knees. He would toss the microphone into the air, catch it on the beat, and spin around in a perfect split. Nobody could outwork him on that stage. He was the ultimate showman. And because of him, Motown Records was printing cash faster than they could count it. The hits just kept pouring out of the studio. Ain't Too Proud to Beg. Beauty is only skin deep. I Wish It Would Rain. Every single time David Ruffin sang a note, another gold record went up on the wall. He was generating unimaginable wealth for the corporation. Millions upon millions of dollars flowed into the Motown accounts directly because of the sweat pouring down his face. He was the undisputed king of the Detroit sound. A young man who started out dodging blows in a rural southern shack was now wearing diamond rings and driving expensive cars. He had achieved the ultimate American dream. The poor boy had finally become royalty. But in the music business, being a king on the stage does not mean you own the kingdom. The applause is loud, but the contracts are quiet. He was a massive money machine for the elite executives pulling the strings. The spotlight was blinding him to the reality of his own success. These executives were quietly building their massive fortunes while he exhausted his physical body. The trap was already set. It was only a matter of time. When you stand on top of the world, the view gets very clear. And what David Ruffin saw from the top of the charts was a terrifying reality. He was the golden goose. He was the one sweating through his suits every night. He was the one hitting those high notes until his throat bled. But when the dust settled and the tours ended, the numbers simply did not make sense. The Temptations were generating massive fortunes, millions in record sales, sold-out theaters, television specials. But the men singing the songs were on a modest allowance. Motown Records operated like a massive factory assembly line, and Berry Gordy was the ultimate boss. The artists were employees. They were given salaries. They were handed allowances. They were driven in fancy cars that they did not truly own. David started looking around. He saw the executives living in absolute luxury while the men actually making the music had to ask for permission to buy a house. He realized the brutal truth of the music industry. Fame is not the same thing as wealth. Applause does not pay the mortgage. He wanted to know where the money was going. He wanted a real accounting of the profits. He wanted what he had earned. Now you have to understand the dynamic at play here. In the 1960s, a black entertainer was expected to smile, sing, and be grateful for the opportunity. Asking questions was dangerous. Demanding a financial audit was career suicide. But David Ruffin did not care. His pride was too big. His ego was fully inflated by the adoration of millions of fans. He looked at what the label did for Diana Ross. They changed her group to Diana Ross and the Supremes. So David demanded the exact same treatment. He told management that the group needed to be renamed David Ruffin and the Temptations. He felt he was the star. He felt he was carrying the entire franchise on his back, and he was not entirely wrong. But telling a powerful executive how to run their business is a dangerous game. The label saw a rebellion. They saw a worker who was getting entirely too loud. So they deployed the oldest tactic in the corporate playbook, divide and conquer. Management began to isolate David. They convinced the other members of the group that David was a threat to their collective success. They made him the enemy inside his own family. The pressure was crushing him. He was fighting the label. He was fighting his bandmates. And underneath all of that, he was still fighting the ghosts of that abusive childhood in Mississippi. When a man has nowhere left to turn, he usually finds a way to numb the pain. For David Ruffin, that escape was cocaine. The drug took his massive ego and amplified it into absolute paranoia. He started missing rehearsals. He started showing up late to massive concerts. He would ride in a private mink-lined limousine separate from the rest of the group. His behavior became incredibly erratic and violent. The man who sang the sweetest love songs was now spiraling into a dark abyss of addiction and anger. He would show up to shows just as they were stepping on stage or miss the flights entirely. He became a massive liability to a corporate machine that demanded absolute perfection and strict obedience. The label executives watched him self-destruct, and they capitalized on his weakness. The label had the perfect excuse. They did not need to negotiate with him anymore. They just needed to cut him out like an infection. In June of 1968, the hammer dropped. The group he helped build into a global phenomenon officially fired him. They brought in a new singer named Dennis Edwards. Just like that, the king was dethroned. They locked him out of the castle. But here is the most sinister part of the entire music business. You can be fired from the stage, but you cannot escape the paperwork. Motown kicked him out of the Temptations, but they absolutely refused to release him from his recording contract. He was trapped. He could not take his voice to another label. He could not go build a new empire somewhere else. The executives held his signature on a piece of paper, and they used it as a weapon. They forced him into a solo career under their strict control. He recorded incredible solo music, masterpieces that proved he was still a vocal genius, but the label would not promote them properly. They let his brilliant work die quietly on the shelves while they poured all their marketing dollars into other compliant artists. They delayed his single releases. They starved him of momentum and starved him of cash. It was a corporate execution done in slow motion. They wanted to make an example out of him. They wanted to show every other artist on the roster exactly what happens when you demand to see the books. You get isolated, you get replaced, and you get frozen in a contract that slowly chokes your career to death. David Ruffin was entirely at the mercy of the men he had just tried to overthrow. He was a caged bird who still had a beautiful voice but nowhere to fly. The industry took his pride, took his group, and took his financial freedom. The descent into the dark had officially begun. David Ruffin refused to accept that it was over. You do not just turn off a star that burns that bright. When the Temptations went on tour with their new lead singer Dennis Edwards, David would follow them. He bought a ticket. He sat in the front row. And when they started singing his songs, the songs he made famous, he would leap out of his seat. He would jump onto the stage and walk right up to Dennis Edwards, snatch the microphone right out of his hand, and start singing. The crowds went absolutely wild. They loved it. But it was a tragedy disguised as entertainment. This was a king who had been overthrown, wandering back into the palace and pretending he still wore the crown. It was desperate. It was heartbreaking. The label security eventually started banning him from the venues. They threw him out the back doors. He was locked out of the very house he helped build. And outside those doors, the reality of his situation was waiting for him. The industry had completely turned its back. When you are making millions of dollars for the executives, everybody is your best friend. They answer your calls. They laugh at your jokes. But the second you become a liability, the phone stops ringing. Motown had moved on. The music industry had moved on. David was left alone with a massive tax debt. The government came looking for their money. They seized his assets. They took his money. He went to jail for tax evasion. He served time behind bars. The man who used to wear silk suits and diamond rings was sitting in a jail cell while his records were still playing on every single radio station across America. Think about that level of mental torture. You hear your own voice blasting from a radio, but you do not have enough money in your pocket to buy a decent meal. The pain was too much. The gap between who he was and who he had become was too wide. So he filled that massive void with drugs. The cocaine addiction morphed into something even darker. He started smoking crack cocaine. This was the 1980s, and crack was destroying entire neighborhoods. It didn't care if you were a famous singer. It didn't care about your gold records. It stripped David Ruffin of his dignity. He was no longer living in luxury. He was spending his days and nights in crack houses in Detroit and Philadelphia. These were dangerous, dirty places where desperate people did desperate things. David would trade anything he had for another hit. He pawned his belongings. He lost his teeth. He lost his health. The brilliant, shining light of Motown was sitting on filthy mattresses in abandoned houses surrounded by misery. People would see him wandering the streets. They would point and whisper. They would recognize him. The mighty David Ruffin reduced to a shadow. There were moments where it looked like he might actually make it back, glimmers of hope. In 1989, the Temptations were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. David stood on that stage with the group one more time. He looked thin, but he smiled. He sang. For one brief shining moment, the world remembered exactly who he was. Fans thought it was the beginning of a massive comeback, a redemption story. But the music industry does not do fairy tales. The industry likes you when you are young and hungry. They do not want to deal with the damaged goods they helped create. After the applause faded and the cameras turned off, David went right back to his demons. He went on a tour with a few old friends, but the money was mismanaged, the stress returned, and the drugs were always right there waiting for him in the dark. He could not outrun the addiction. It was a vicious cycle that he simply could not break. Which brings us right back to the end, June 1st, 1991, Philadelphia. We need to look closely at what really happened in those final hours. David had recently finished a successful tour. He actually had a significant amount of money on him. Friends and family stated he had a money belt strapped to his waist holding $40,000 in cash. $40,000. That was his lifeline. That was the money he had literally sweat blood to earn. He went to a known crack house in West Philadelphia. What happened inside that house remains a dark mystery. The people in that house knew exactly who he was. They knew he had cash. When he collapsed from a massive drug overdose, the people around him did not call an ambulance right away. They didn't try to save his life. Instead, they robbed him. They stripped the money belt right off his dying body. They took every single penny he had left in the world. Then they loaded his unconscious body into a borrowed limousine. They drove him to the hospital. But they did not walk him inside. They did not stay to answer questions. They opened the car door, dumped him onto the cold pavement in front of the emergency room, and sped away into the night. They threw him away like he was nothing. A human being who had given the world so much beauty was left to die on the concrete completely alone, without a dollar to his name. The doctors could not save him. His heart just gave out. The official cause of death was an adverse reaction to drugs. But the truth is, his heart had been breaking for decades, broken by an abusive father, broken by a greedy music industry, broken by the crushing weight of fame. The executives who made millions off his voice were sleeping comfortably in their mansions. The fans who danced to his music were living their lives. And David Ruffin was lying in a morgue, a tragic, terrifying end to a magnificent life. David Ruffin was 50 years old. He gave the world some of the greatest love songs ever recorded. But on the day he died, the industry he built did not pause to mourn his loss. They kept selling his records. They kept collecting the publishing and the royalties, while his family was left with nothing but his memories. This is not just a story about drugs or bad decisions. This is a story about a system designed to use every drop of talent and discard the real human being once the hits stop coming. It is a story about the importance of owning your work and knowing your true value in a world that sees you only as a product. David Ruffin was a king, but he was a king without a kingdom because he did not own the deed to his own voice. So y'all do me a favor. After this video ends, go find his music, pull up My Girl or Ain't Too Proud to Beg. But this time just listen to it differently. Listen to the deep, raspy grit in his throat. Listen to the pain of a boy from Mississippi and the pride of a man from Detroit. He deserved so much more than a cold sidewalk in Philadelphia. He deserved respect and his recognition that the industry denied him while he was alive. Never forget the name David Ruffin, the greatest voice of the Motown era. Rest in peace to the true soul of Temptations.